All right, now we're going to be in Mark chapter 11. Where we are at in Jesus' journey. It shows he and the 12 are finally getting to Jerusalem. This is a big deal. This is a turning point in the book of Mark, where he has been in Galilee. They have traveled from Galilee through multiple different cities and areas, and now they are here in Jesus' last week of ministry before he is crucified. And what we're about to see is that the Son of Man is going to suffer. Now, as we go through this part of the text, I'll go ahead and preface with we're going to get into the woods a little bit. We're going through the triumphant entry, and I'm going to try to pull out as much of the Old Testament as I can to show you why this is significant. And so as I do so, it might get kind of like, wow, we are so far in the weeds. And so this is what I want you to remember, even if you are like, what are we even talking about at this point? I hope that you don't reach that. I don't expect you to, but just in case. If it gets where it's like, what in the world is happening? This is the main thing I want you to think about, because this is where we're going to get, is what are we learning about Mark's Jesus in this text? Because I'm going to ask that at the end of it. What are we going to learn? What do we see about the Jesus that Mark shows us, portrays? And so keep that in mind as we go through this text. So, this is Sunday, the first day of the week, where Jesus comes into Jerusalem. And we'll start in verses 1 through 3. It says, as they approached Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples and said to them, go into the village opposite you. And immediately, as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, on which no one yet has ever sat. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone says to you, why are you doing this? You say, the Lord has need of it, and immediately he will send it back here. So we'll go through a few things to kind of set up what this is going to look like, and maybe some details that we'll need. Bethphage is a village that is just outside of the walls of Jerusalem. It's less than a mile from the city's walls, and it is considered just kind of a suburb of Jerusalem. And so it's considered under Jerusalem's territory or reign or whatever. Another thing to point out is the Mount of Olives. It's about 3/4 of a mile away from Bethphage. It's east of Jerusalem. The mount is about 2,700 feet at its peak, which is roughly 200 feet higher than Mount Zion. So Mount Zion, of course, is where Jerusalem is. So if you're on the Mount of Olives at the very top, you have a pretty good view of Jerusalem. You can see the temple, and you can see all the things that are happening there in the city. And so this would give you a very beautiful view, and you could especially see the temple and the things around. So it is designated, and I'm going to try as we go through this. I actually have a reason for the colors I'm using today. If it's green, then I'm probably pulling out the Old Testament, because I'm doing that a lot in today's class. And so it is designated, the Mount of Olives is, as the place where God's glorious final revelation will be given to man. On the final day of time, this is very much like an end times idea here, but both in Zechariah and in Ezekiel, it uses the Mount of Olives to say that God's voice will come from the Mount of Olives on this final day, and whether that's, of course, it could be symbolic and whatnot, but the idea here is the Mount of Olives is an important mountain, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. Now let's look at just what's happening. Jesus sends two of his disciples to a nearby village, probably Bethphage, and they get an untrained, unused, unsat-on donkey. Well, colt of a donkey, really. I think the question is, why is there a need for a colt of a donkey who's not been used, who's been unsat on? Why is that important? Well, first let's look at the fact that these kinds of animals who hadn't really been used or sat on, they would be used for some kind of religious purpose. They'd be dedicated to God in some way. So I have those verse references on the screen where this idea is shown, where we get an animal who's kind of unblemished or untouched, and to be dedicated to God. And so this is significant as to what Jesus is about to do and who he is about to show himself to be in a way. This is significant because it shows that he is worthy of this donkey, which would usually be dedicated to God because he is the Son of God. Now, practically here, it kind of sounds like Jesus says, hey, go steal a donkey. It kind of does. And if I'm just reading this text in my lens, I think, is he telling the disciples, like, go steal this colt of a donkey? And that's kind of odd. But there's some specific reasons why he says, go untie this colt of a donkey. If anybody asks about it, say this, that, and the other. And one is to fulfill prophecy. We see in Zechariah 9:9, and Mark doesn't bring this out, but Matthew does, in Matthew chapter 21. Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9 states that the coming king would ride into Jerusalem on a colt. And so Jesus was to ride into Jerusalem on a donkey. And so Matthew's account emphasizes this, the Old Testament, a lot. Mark doesn't do it as much. That's probably one reason Mark doesn't include it. Different purposes here. But we do see that in Matthew. And during this time, here's another point. During this time, if a king or a Roman soldier needed to use a working animal, like a donkey, then they could just use it at will. They could just take it, and that was acceptable. So for his disciples to say, the Lord needs it, seems to imply that the King of the Jews, the King of heaven, is in need of this colt. And so it's allowed. Now look, the word Lord can mean three different things. It can mean master, it can mean sir, or it can mean someone who is divine, as we would say Lord. And I don't know exactly how the disciples are meaning it. I don't know if the disciples are saying, like, my master needs it. I'm not sure, but I would like to think, just based on what we see in the text, and it seems like they're using it in a divine way. Like there is a king, there is someone who really matters here, who needs it. And so I can take it. And so they say, oh, okay. The people around say that's fine. All right, so we get into verses 4 through 6. And so it says what the disciples do. It says they went away and found a colt tied at the door outside in the street, and they untied it. Some of the bystanders were saying to them, what are you doing, untying the colt? They spoke to them just as Jesus had told them, and they gave them permission. Now notice that Mark records the disciples doing exactly what Jesus has told them to do, in exactly the order that Jesus has said it. It's gone, Jesus says, go into the village. Well, they went away. Jesus says, untie it and bring it here. And then it says they went to the village and they untied it. And it says, now someone's going to say to you this, and they do, then say this. Well, then we have Mark recording. Some bystanders saw them and said this, and they said this. So it's kind of a mirror image of each other. They said exactly what Jesus said is exactly what happened. And I think maybe it's not worth questioning, but in my mind it's worth questioning. Why does Mark spend so much time talking to us about how the disciples untied this colt and brought it to Jesus? Questions like this are not unhealthy to ask. In fact, they're good questions because they at least challenge you and maybe puzzle you a bit and force you to look deeper into the text. And so this question, why does Mark take so long on this, I think is a valid question because, if you were just to tell me this is the story, how is Mark going to tell it? I would probably say something like, immediately the disciples, after being told to do so by Jesus, got up, went to the village, got a colt, and brought it to Jesus. And we could fit it in one verse. It'd probably be pretty fast because that's usually how Mark tells stories. He might toss in a detail here and there, but for the most part, it's cut and dry. This is what happens, and we're moving on. But in this instance, we have Mark, for a relatively extended period of time, considering what seems to be insignificant, telling the disciples, or showing the story where Jesus tells the disciples, here's all that I need you to do, and then this is exactly what happened. And so the question is why? If I were to look at stories where I thought maybe Mark could go into more detail, that may be more useful than this, I would probably look at the stories that the disciples told in Mark chapter 6, verses 30 and 32, where it says, after they had done all of these amazing things that Jesus had told them and trained them to do, they got back together and they told stories about it. But Mark doesn't say anything about what was said. I would love to have heard what was said in those stories and some of those things that happened. I have a lot of questions about what happened in feeding the 5,000 and the 4,000 and about what that looked like. And I think it would have been really nice if Mark would have gone into more detail about this is exactly how it happened. This is what it looked like when the bread was being broken and then Jesus just kept breaking bread. And I can't explain it, but this is what happened. And it was amazing, but we don't get those details. But man, we get a lot of details about the disciples untying a colt. And so why? Okay, so let's get into some of it. Some scholars are led to believe, and look, let me time out here by saying, maybe I'm looking too far into the text. Maybe I read too much and went crazy. Who knows? But I think that this is at least a question worth exploring, and if it's not, then you're going to have to explore it with me anyways. But some scholars are led to believe that there's a reason Mark spends so long on talking about why the disciples untie a colt. And they tie it to Jacob's blessing over Judah in Genesis chapter 49. And so let's turn to Genesis chapter 49 because this is a pretty significant text. In Genesis chapter 49, okay, we're looking around verses 8 through 12. Pre-Christian Jews, so before Christ had come, Jews had interpreted this text, they interpret this text messianically. They see this prophecy, this blessing of Judah, as one that will eventually be fulfilled with the coming Messiah. Now, they don't know who that is. This is before Christ comes. And even in this time, they're going to look at this text and say it's messianic and probably not even know that Jesus is fulfilling it. But that's how they're going to look at this text. And so in Genesis chapter 49, verses 8 through 12, what we see is the father, Jacob, Israel, and he is prophesying about what is to come for his sons. And so in this prophecy, in verses 8 through 12, he's talking to Judah. So let's look at verse 10. He says in verse 10, the scepter, well, actually, let's start in, we may as well start in verse 8. It says, Judah, your brother shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down to you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He couches. He lies down as a lion, and as a lion who dares rouse him up. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. He ties his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He washes his garments in wine, and his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are dull from wine, and his teeth white from milk. Main verses here, verses 10 and 11, I think that we're going to see. And really, I think you can lump verse 9 into that as well. So let's ask some questions that maybe you're asking. One, how do they connect this verse to Jesus? Why would they read this verse and think maybe this is a prophecy about the one who is to come? So we'll start in verse 10 here. Verse 10 is a difficult verse to translate. I'm reading from the New American Standard from the year 1995, and so that's what is not on the screen because I didn't put Genesis 49 on my PowerPoint, but that's what I just read from. And so it says Shiloh. It just says in verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. So that's what mine says. Other translations may say something like, he to whom it, talking about the ruler's staff, the one who holds the scepter. It says, he to whom it belongs. It might say, until he whose right it is comes. Or it even might say, until Shiloh, the Messiah, the peaceful one, comes. Just depending on what translation you're using. That's a pretty broad range of translations I just gave you. But it's all kind of getting to the same point, trying to translate the same word. Out of all 33 times that the word Shiloh is used in the Old Testament, 32 of them are pointing to Ephraim, pointing to a city, a place of rest. But this one time, it seems to be pointing to something different. And so pretty much everybody seems to think that this is a messianic idea, and it's referring to the peaceful one, or the one who is to come. And he is the one who's going to be the Lion of Judah, who's going to hold the scepter. And so this is the idea that Jacob seems to be getting at when he uses this word. There's going to be one to come. There's going to be a peaceful one. And someone's coming out of Judah, who's going to be the Lion of Judah, verse 9, and he's going to hold the scepter, which is a symbol of authority and law, verse 10. And this person will be obeyed by all people. We see at the end of verse 10. So who else could this be applying to? If not Jesus, let's say this isn't Jesus. Who else could this be applying to? Well, we see David partially fulfill this prophecy. David comes out of the tribe of Judah. He's a strong and mighty warrior, and he also reigned as king. He's the Lion of Judah who also holds the scepter, right? But ultimately, I think this prophecy is fulfilled with Jesus. He's the Lion of Judah, Revelation 5:5. He also holds all power and authority. And so why consider this a messianic prophecy? Why do I even think that Jesus fulfills this at all? Well, let's first establish, I don't think that Jacob is saying this and thinking there's going to be a guy to come a long way down the line who's going to be Jesus, and this is what's going to happen. I don't necessarily know if Jacob is thinking of these things when he's talking about Judah. But just because of prophecy, just like most likely in Isaiah 7, just because a prophecy may not immediately be talking about Jesus, that doesn't mean Jesus isn't going to fulfill it a little bit later on. And that might have been kind of confusing, and I'd love to explain it, but I'd end up going on for about 10 minutes on something different. But you can study prophecies to understand that sometimes it may not directly be referring to Jesus in the moment, but Jesus still fulfills it later on as the one who is to come. So, that aside, I think that's a beautiful thing about the Bible. This is, because it's a divine work, it's from God, is that the Bible can tie up a lot of ends and a lot of things throughout hundreds of years and point it to Jesus. And I think that's what's happening here, and this is why. In Ezekiel chapter 21, verses 26 and 27, it shows Ezekiel telling Zedekiah, who is he calls him the Prince of Israel. He's the last king of Judah. And he tells him to take off his crown in Ezekiel chapter 21. Here we go. Verse 26, he says, remove the turban, take off the crown. And then in verse 27, he says this, a ruin, a ruin, a ruin. I will make it. This also will be no more. Talking about Israel. There will be no more until he comes whose right it is. I will give it to him. Sounds pretty familiar, right? And this is absolutely talking about Jesus. Zedekiah is the last king of Judah. He says, go ahead and take off that crown. I'll give it to someone else a little bit later on, and he'll wear it when Israel's restored. And so this in Ezekiel is absolutely talking about Jesus, and it sounds just about exactly the same. I think that they kind of alludes to Genesis 49, talking about the one who is to come. He's going to be the Lion of Judah. He's going to hold this scepter. And in Genesis 49, it talks about how he is going to bring Judah prosperity and peace, which we see in David, but we're also ultimately going to see in Jesus, that's what Jesus is going to do. So, if this is a messianic prophecy in mind, we've worked through all of these, gotten through the weeds a bit. If this is a messianic prophecy that we're talking about here in Genesis 49, where Jesus is going to fulfill it, then why would we think that Mark has this prophecy in mind? What in the text of Mark is going to point us to all of this? Well, there's actually a couple of things in this chapter, first off, that is not just as point blank as we would like it to be, and we have to interpret it a bit. See the fig tree that hopefully we'll get to here in a little bit. In Genesis 49, verse 11, it points to the comfort and the prosperity that Judah will have when this peaceful one, the one who is to come, when he comes. And one of the things mentioned in describing this peace is he ties his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. So now, understanding that Jews are going to read Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, in a messianic way. They're going to read this text as this is the one who is to come. This is the one who's going to save us. We can make some possible conclusions about what Mark is doing here. And the attention, I think, that's given to the point that Jesus commands his disciples to untie the donkey or the colt of a donkey and how long it takes and why Mark goes into such detail about it, I think it just points to the messianic nature of what's happening in that the colt of a donkey was prophesied about. He's going to be tied up, and you're going to untie him and bring him to Jesus. And you can kind of tie together what we see in Genesis 49, what we see in Zechariah 9:9 about how he's going to ride a colt into Jerusalem and multiple other places. And look, the untying itself, like the disciples going untying, by itself, it holds no real significance. But I would think it's possible that maybe Jesus has this in mind. Those around him know that Genesis 49, verse 10 is a messianic prophecy. And Jesus is saying, go and untie this colt. There's going to be a colt tied. Don't grab another one. Grab the one that's tied up. Untie it. If anybody asks you about it, say this and bring it to me. So Mark says that's exactly what happened, showing us that guy that you think about in Genesis 49:10 who is going to come, he's going to bring peace, and he's going to be the Lion of Judah and hold the scepter, and he's going to have all rule and authority and power, is the one who's about to ride on this colt. I think that that's at least worth exploring. I thought it was an interesting thought when I studied it. Someone just sent me a picture, I think, of the Mount of Olives, and I would love to look at it, but I would get very distracted if I looked at such a text. But I appreciate it. I'll look at it right after this class. So let's get into verse 7. We're out of the weeds, and we're back into just the text of Mark. But then we're going to go back in a little later on, so prepare yourself. Verse 7, it says, they brought the colt to Jesus and put their coats on it, and he sat on it. And many spread their coats in the road, and others spread leafy branches, which they had cut from the fields. And so Mark doesn't really point out the significance of this, but I feel it's worth mentioning why Jesus rides the colt, and we see that he fulfills the prophecy in Zechariah 9:9. Zechariah 9:9 says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Zechariah 9:9. Matthew points this out. He brings this to the attention of the reader more than Mark does. But I felt it important to point out because this is a really big moment in Mark's gospel. So let's extract everything we can about what's happening here. And what's happening here is Jesus is fulfilling some prophecies, showing himself to be the Son of God, the Messiah, who is to come by just riding this donkey into Jerusalem. Most kings are going to want to present themselves in the most powerful way. And a donkey doesn't typically scream, "I'm a very powerful guy." Instead, they might ride on a mighty stallion, a big horse, to show their authority. But Jesus rides in on the colt of a donkey. It presents him as a humble or gentle king, which is what we see in Zechariah 9:9, who brings salvation to those in Jerusalem. And so it portrays him, just him riding on this donkey, portrays him as a humble and gentle king, though he's doing something so mighty, and though he is so much greater than all other kings. And so we'll look at a few things here. One, the spreading of the cloaks on the ground was the way that they would treat a king. At least that's what we see in 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 13 with Jehu. This is what they did with him. And it appears that they recognized Jesus' kingship and his royalty as he entered into the holy city of David. And now they've got these leafy branches. Now John, in John chapter 12, verse 13, identifies these as big palm branches. And they get these big palm branches and lay them out as well. And this is something that they may do for someone who's very triumphant. And we kind of see that in the Maccabees. There's a couple of different people, which the Maccabees are just Jewish history. Not inspired, it's not in our Bibles, but it's helpful for our sake in understanding maybe what Jews would do. And so we see in the Maccabees that this is how they treated heroes who were triumphant. And they do it a couple of times. They would lay out leafy branches. And so Jesus is kind of presented here as this mighty king and this hero. At least that's how the people treat him. So we get into verse 9. In verses 9 and 10, as Jesus walks in, it says that those who went in front and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." So we see both people in the front of Jesus and behind him. They greet him with Psalm 118, verse 26. And there's a few things to pick apart here. One is that Psalms 113 through 118 are called Hallel Psalms. All that means is they were all used for worship purposes and on like Passover or the Feast of the Tabernacles to praise God. And so because this was the week of the Passover that we're in right now, this would be an appropriate use. They're greeting people who are coming in, who are here for Passover. Those who were traveling to the holy city for Passover to Jerusalem, they would sing these Hallel Psalms while ascending up to Jerusalem, up to the temple, and to focus on prayer and thanksgiving. And so these Psalms in Israel's culture had a pretty significant purpose. Now the word Hosanna is a word that typically means save us. But because of its use in like worship and in praise, how people would use it in Psalms such as this, it could also mean something like hallelujah. If you're in this time, you could probably understand it that way as well. And so another thing, the way that people used it in this moment, Psalm 118, verse 26, it serves as a religious greeting to one who has come up for the festival or for the Passover. They're greeting them in this way. However, it's kind of funny to think that those who are singing the psalm probably don't understand just how fitting it is to use for Jesus. Blessed is the one who is to come. in the name of the Lord, or who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David, Hosanna in the highest. They probably don't understand that this coming kingdom of their father David, this is the guy who's about to establish it. And so, at least what I'm getting at is I don't think they recognize his full divinity. I don't think they still, even though they're treating him this way, I don't know if they recognize fully who Jesus is, because I don't know if really anybody does until he dies and he raises again. But I thought that this was interesting. So, Jewish rabbis, they would look at Psalm 118, verse 25 and following, verse 26 and so on, and they would see this as some kind of, in a redemptive lens. Like, this psalm talks about our redemption and how we will be redeemed and saved. And so they saw this section of the psalm as one that points toward a final redemption, where the eternal Davidic kingdom would be established and the Messiah would reign. And so this is likely why they say, blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. That's not really, I don't think that's really in the psalm. They're just saying that. And so they're saying, blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. But this is also why they follow that up with the phrase, Hosanna, which likely means save us in this instance. Hosanna, or save us, in the highest, you who dwell on high, save us. And so Passover becomes a very hopeful time for the Jews as they await this Messiah to redeem them. And I think that's reflected in this psalm, is that they're waiting for this Messiah to come, and he's there. So, does the phrase, he who comes in the name of the Lord, does it sound familiar? The phrase, he who comes, right? It's what we just talked about in Genesis. It's what we talked about in Ezekiel. And it seems to once again allude back to this, maybe, seems to allude back to this prophecy in Genesis 49, verse 10. There's a mighty king who's coming, and he's going to bring peace to Judah. And what these people may not realize is that this mighty king from Genesis 49 is walking through the doors of the gates. He is going into Jerusalem as they sing about his arrival. So, I think it's important to note that Mark never explicitly says or tells us that the people in this crowd actually believe that Jesus is the Messiah. I think that there's enough in the text to assume that these people recognize Jesus as special, royal even. But I don't know if they understand everything about him and his mission. Like I said, I'm not sure anybody really does until we get to the resurrection. But it's quite likely, I think, that they've heard John the Baptist proclaim about the kingdom to come. They've heard about the message that Mark talks about in Mark chapter 1, verse 14, about how Jesus has come to proclaim the gospel, the good news of the kingdom. I think it's quite likely that they know of Jesus' message, and that's how they treat him. So, let's take a step out for a second. We just kind of dug into a lot throughout the Bible. But let's just picture it for a moment. I wanted to harp on the Old Testament significance, the prophecies that are definitely and that could be fulfilled here. But for the sake of us continuing on, we need to take a step back and picture this. Jesus finally reaches Jerusalem, where he knows his time is coming that he will die. And yet, walking toward the gates of the city in which he will be tried and eventually sentenced to death, he's treated as a king. So if you were to see this from Jesus' point of view, I'm just trying to picture it in my mind here so when we can see this, how cool and how big of a deal this is. If you were to picture this in your mind from Jesus' point of view and you're sitting on the colt, you'd likely see the gates in front of you and the open doors. You could probably see the temple up ahead. It's huge. I'm sure that you can see the temple over the gates. You have all of these coats and palm branches lying on the ground on the road that your colt is walking on. You have all these people lining the road, singing this psalm about you, whether they know it or not, and praising God and greeting you. And Jesus is walking toward the gates. And if I'm looking at this from the gates, and I'm just looking at what is happening right now, I see the king clearer and clearer with every step of the donkey. With every step that they get closer to the gates, I'm seeing the king who is to come get closer and closer to the place where he is about to clear out the temple, establish his reign. He's going to die, but he's going to rise again. And all this is going to happen very soon. And so the main point here is that the king's arrived. The king has come, and he's entered Jerusalem. So, this is where we ask. We just talked about a lot about Jesus, about prophecies he could be fulfilling, about prophecies that he is absolutely fulfilling, and what that says about him. And so, based on all these things that we covered, what are just some things or one thing that you took away about what we can learn about Mark's Jesus?
This scene in particular is, from a human point of view, it's a mixed kind of thing, because he knows they don't understand, and yet he deserves this praise, and yet he knows what's coming. So it's not a singular thing that's happening. It's very complex, and what Jesus is doing is pushing through other people's intentions and understandings and misunderstandings, and doing what he came to do. And then, people will be left to make their own decisions. But he didn't get thrown off of his course by other people, and that's remarkable.
Certainly. Jeremy is pointing out that Jesus is determined with a line of people who absolutely don't understand Jesus' real mission here. His own disciples don't understand. And Mark has very clearly showed that to us. These people don't really probably understand either that Jesus is about to suffer and die. There's no way. And so even if they recognize him as a king or as the one who is to come, they are not thinking of him as the suffering servant, as the Son of Man who's going to suffer. No way. No chance. And so Jeremy's pointing out that there's probably some tension, some conflicting emotions, because Jesus is a person with thoughts and emotions. It's likely that he's kind of got this, I am deserving of this praise as the king who is to come. And this is, the psalm that they're singing is literally talking about me. But also, these people don't know who I am. And I'm also walking to the place that I'm going to be sentenced and tried and will have to go to be crucified. And so there's kind of some tension here of, I'm receiving what is deserved, but also I'm walking toward the place I'm about to die. And nobody knows me still. And even amidst all of this confusion and probably cloudiness and blurriness in the mind of Jesus, which I appreciate you bringing up, he still determines to walk forward. I can't even imagine walking toward the place, especially in this way, walking toward the place that I'm eventually going to have to be scourged, and that I'm eventually going to be sentenced to crucifixion. I probably won't be running the other way. And yet here he is walking toward this place knowing he's got a mission. There's a reason that he's coming in. That's a really good point. Is there anything else, or we'll move on? Yeah, Deontay.
Probably really unexpected also as to how they foresaw the king who would eventually come. So you mentioned about the donkey, right? He's not coming on a horse. And so presumably, when the Roman officials, high Roman officials, or Herod would come to town, to Jerusalem, they would come on a horse. And that's a demonstration of power, of might, of strength. Right? He's not coming on a horse, he's coming on a gentle, docile animal like a donkey. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't have this great procession with these high ruling officials or Pharisees and Sadducees who welcome him in.
Doesn't look like a king, right?
Yeah, it doesn't look like a king. And one of those people in the crowd was a blind man, Bartimaeus. And so it probably looked very unexpectedly, like they didn't expect it to be in that way, right? And he's also not wielding a sword. That's just kind of
right.
They might be thinking he's going to, overthrow the Romans and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And so that's just one thing that comes to my mind. It probably didn't look like they thought it would look when Jesus came to town.
Oh, absolutely. Hey, this is Deontay, by the way. He's going to be here for the next 3 weeks, so you should come meet him after class starts. But you talk, so you brought this on yourself. And so Deontay brings up a good point, is that, and this is something that we talked about a lot, but these Jewish misconceptions about who the Messiah is going to be and what he's going to look like probably wasn't this guy on a colt of a donkey. That's kind of, I would imagine slowly, because he's on the colt of a donkey, riding into Jerusalem. They're probably thinking this big mighty king on a horse. And so even if they understand a bit of who Jesus is, they absolutely don't understand all of it. There's no way. Yeah, Bob. Certainly.
Jesus. And in Matthew's account, as you know, the children were even shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. So they were actually saying things that sounded like they knew his mission.
Yeah.
I don't think they did. I totally agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
But that was all to make these things fulfilled. And we remember that the kings of Israel, many of them rode on donkeys. That was a sign of royalty in that time. In fact, when Adonijah tried to usurp the throne, then David made provisions for Solomon to ride on his. It is David's view. So that was a sign.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So I guess it's a bit of a countercultural thing for Rome, who probably would not see the donkey as a sign of royalty, but for Jews, they would. Okay, so thank you for bringing that up, because I had not noticed that. And so, yeah, so Bob is pointing out that there's a reason that all this is happening, of course, and Jesus is fulfilling multiple prophecies, and that this donkey does mean something to the Jews, though it probably means nothing to the Romans, who are kind of in charge here. But yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Okay, so, oh yeah, of course. Absolutely, and that's what Zechariah 9 talks about. And thank you for bringing that up. And so one thing that we see about Jesus is that he is a humble and gentle king. And they almost don't, those words or phrases almost don't go together at all. But that's what we see of Jesus. And that's what Zechariah 9 says. It says that this humble servant who's going to bring salvation to Israel. And Matthew says, at least in the New American Standard, Matthew kind of uses that and says he's a gentle king, because the idea is the same. Is that Jesus is coming in. He's not some big Roman official. He's a humble and he's a gentle king. And that's something that we can learn about Jesus as well. I mean, look at all of the times before this that he's talked about. The last shall be first. That you have to accept the kingdom as these children. I want you to be like these children. And how many times Jesus has been and shown humility and gentleness. And so this is par for the course. Even in walking into Jerusalem as a king, he still shows himself to be humble on the colt of a donkey. And so thank you for bringing that up. Now, we might get there. Let's move on a little further. We get to verse 11. It says, Jesus entered Jerusalem and came into the temple, and after looking around at everything, he left for Bethany with the 12, since it was already late. I thought, as reading this, it's like, I feel like after this big grand moment, Jesus is about to come in here and do something awesome. We had this great moment of his triumphant entry, and so now he's going to come in, and I don't really know what to expect, but he's going to do something really cool. And it says he just surveyed the temple and then he left, basically, which was, for me, a little bit underwhelming. I was like, wow, I know what's happening, but I'm trying to read this as the first time. So if I'm reading this for the first time, I think, man, this is kind of sad. I expected something really cool here, but nothing really happens other than he surveys the temple and he leaves. Now, the next day, something really cool happens, and we might get there. Worth noting, though, that the house he's staying in Bethany, based on these couple texts I have on the screen, is most likely Mary, Martha, and Lazarus' house that they're staying in. And so the other Gospels kind of cover that more than Mark does. So let's get into Monday, and we'll just get through as much of this as we can, and if we're not going to get through it all, so it's okay. Verses 12 through 14. On the next day, Monday, when they had left Bethany, he became hungry. Seeing at a distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if perhaps he would find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat from you again." And his disciples were listening. And now look, we're not going to be able to go into all that I would love to go into with this fig tree. And so what I'll tell you is, it seems like Jesus throws a temper tantrum first time you read it. It seems like Jesus has a case of the hangries. He's hungry and angry. And so he just gets mad at this fig tree, which Mark points out is pretty significant because it's not in season, and Jesus knows it's not in season. And so just cold reading this, you think, why is Jesus so mad at this fig tree when he knows it's not in season? But we get an answer. Well, I'll take that back. We don't really get an answer. Mark does not just blatantly tell us that this is why Jesus got so mad at the fig tree. So we have to interpret a bit. And what we see, and this is fast version here, what we see is that the fig tree often represents Israel in prophetic literature, in the prophets. Often represents Israel. And so him casting judgment on this fig tree is kind of just showing the spiritual state of Israel. in that they're dead. And what's going to happen to Jerusalem is just total destruction. That's what we're going to see a little bit later on. So what Mark does, and we're not going to get to it, but what Mark does, we'll talk about it tomorrow at coffee. We'll have coffee tomorrow. We'll cover the rest of this. But what Mark does is he sandwiches a story in between the main narrative. The main narrative is Jesus sees this fig tree, he curses it. We have something that happens at the temple, and right after that, as they're walking back, Peter says, hey, that fig tree's dead. I guess like you said it would be. And so sandwiched in between that, we have Jesus clearing the temple and getting upset because they have turned his father's house into a den of robbers instead of a house of worship. And so that kind of tells us that, the fact that that's sandwiched in the middle and how the wicked the Israelite people are and their spiritual state, it kind of tells us this is what this fig tree idea means. We know what fig trees mean in Old Testament literature, and we see how upset Jesus is because Israel has just been wicked. And so that's what this fig tree means. I know that was a fast version. I have more in my notes, and we'll talk about this more tomorrow at coffee. And so that will be it. Class dismissed.